Our next speaker this morning is part of that interdisciplinary perspective that I spoke about as we began our tea break. And she comes to us from Goldsmiths, University of London. And I apologize, but I at an age where I travel with 3 pairs of glasses, depending upon the distance, and I have the wrong pair on. Dr. Greco completed her bachelor's degree in arts and history with Latin, and then her master's degree in critical theory from the University of Sussex. She then completed a PhD at the European University Institute in the Department of Social and Political Sciences in 1996. Broadly informed by the French tradition of historical epistemology, and particularly by the work of Michel Foucault, her thesis examined psychosomatics as a specifically modern space of problemization. The monograph that emerged from the thesis, entitled Illness as a Work of Thought, was published by Routledge in 1998 and was nominated for the Philip Abrams Prize of the British Sociological Association. Since then, she has continued to develop a historically informed program of research on the implications of bifurcated thought for medicine and for social scientific approaches to medicine, particularly around questions concerning the relationship between personal agency and health and disease. In the course of her career at Goldsmiths, this program of research has directly fed into her research through her teaching through the design and delivery of 4 undergraduate options: medicine as culture, emotions and social life, the body, social theory, and social practice. Subjectivity, health and medicine, social theory and social practice was the 3rd, subjectivity, health and medicine the 4th, and 2 master's options, nature and culture and bodies and pain. Her research has attracted international recognition in multiple forms, including the award of a fellowship of the Humboldt Foundation in 2002-2003 for a study entitled Life and Normativity, a reappraisal of vitalism. I would like to welcome to the platform a former faculty member of the Octagon at Life University and currently a professor at Goldsmiths, University of London, Dr. Monica Greco.
No time to rest. Just do your best. What you hear is not a test.
My turn to say thank you all very much for being here. And thank you, Jerry, for inviting me to be here today. I have very, very fond memories of my first visit to Life University in Marietta in 2009. And so I'm especially delighted to be able to rekindle that relationship and, yes, reestablish it. We heard from Richard earlier about the relative advantages of being blind when giving a talk, and we heard from Jerry a moment ago about glasses. Well, I've only just acquired my very first pair of glasses, and I've never given a talk with them. I'm not sure whether I'll need them or not, so I guess they will be the focus of my nerves today. Okay, so I've been invited specifically today as an outsider, to the profession of chiropractic, to speak about vitalism and how this concept is used and perceived in a much broader academic context. So I'm going to begin by saying that the term vitalism in academic circles today and the concept of vitalism has a very strange double life, a double set of connotations. On the one hand, there are many who regard it as an obsolete and discredited concept, a concept that some, like biologist Richard Dawkins, squarely associate with lack of intellectual rigor, indeed pseudoscience, if you like, anti-scientific attitudes, and even superstition. Indeed, if you were to look up vitalism on Wikipedia, this is the very first impression that you would get. I think the first line says, vitalism is a discredited hypothesis rejected by modern science. So if you're Googling vitalism, this is what you see. On the other hand, and I want to stress this, some of the most exciting, some of the most provocative work taking place today professes to be vitalist. This work is inspired by developments in contemporary science, about which I think we'll hear some later, and by influential thinkers like, for example, Gilles Deleuze or Georges Canguilhem, both of whom describe themselves as vitalists. I'll come back to Canguilhem in particular a bit later. Or inspired by the mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who described his own approach as a philosophy of organism. To use the word of Robert Mitchell, who is a professor of English at Duke University, I'm quoting from him, "A vitalist turn seems to be underway in contemporary natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities." So, what's going on here? How can vitalism be, on the one hand, discredited, obsolete, and on the other hand, really cutting edge all at the same time? Are we talking about one and the same concept here? So what I'm hoping to do today is to develop a distinction that will help us think through this issue, think through this double connotation. It's a distinction between classical and contemporary forms of vitalism, a distinction between vitalism in the context of a Newtonian understanding of nature versus vitalism in the context of a post-Newtonian understanding of nature. How the meaning of vitalism and the function of vitalism changes somewhat in the passage from one context to the other. And in my conclusion, I am going to make some remarks linking vitalism with the concept of complexity, which is one that doesn't necessarily, well, in fact, very often is used to refute vitalism, indeed. So, classical vitalism. Classical vitalism refers to a series of debates among European chemists, physicians, and biologists of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Broadly speaking, these debates centered on the claim that the explanation of living phenomena is not compatible with principles of basic sciences like physics and chemistry. This is the meaning of vitalism as we still find it in dictionary definitions, as the one that you can see behind me from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Now, classical vitalism today is an object of active interest and research really only for historians. In the last 25 years, this interest has intensified and the literature on vitalism has grown considerably. Historians have begun to unfold some of the multiple meanings and ideas that are usually, grouped under the umbrella term vitalism. So they argue, for example, that we shouldn't confuse the animistic vitalism of the German physician and chemist Georg Stahl, who was writing in the early part of the 18th century, with the medical vitalism of the Montpellier school in the late 18th century France. And these, in turn, should never be confused with the neo-vitalism that became influential in the early part of the 20th century through the work of the embryologist Hans Driesch. So we get a very loud message from this scholarship, a very strong message. Historically, the differences between vitalists have been at least as great, and sometimes even greater, than the differences between vitalists and non-vitalists. So from a historian's perspective, then the next thing to do is to construct a sufficiently sophisticated typology to account for all these different varieties of vitalism. And this is an example of such a typology. It's a very busy slide, so don't worry about looking at the details of it. In some ways, the point of the slide is to show how busy it is, how many varieties there are. For Benton, vitalists differ, for example, first of all, in terms of their degree of epistemological skepticism, or to turn it around, their degree of metaphysical daring. Some of them, like Stahl in the early 18th century, or like Johannes Müller in the 19th century, posited the existence of a metaphysical agency or entity, something like a spirit, a mind, a soul, a vital force. And this was understood to be the cause of all living phenomena. Benton calls these realist vitalists. Others didn't believe in the existence of such a metaphysical agency. Instead, they tried to describe principles, laws governing vital phenomena that you might be able to systematize and deduce through careful observation. Organic and natural laws, but just different from those of physics and chemistry. An example of this for Benton is the anatomist and physiologist Bichat. And Benton calls this type of vitalism phenomenalist vitalism. As I said, I'm not going to dwell on all the details of Benton's typology. I'm just going to make a very general point. On the one hand, such a typology is both interesting and useful. It corrects many common misconceptions surrounding the term vitalism. For example, it tells us that vitalists, not all vitalists, were committed to the belief in a life force. So vitalism doesn't necessarily mean that. It also tells us that vitalist explanations are not necessarily teleological. They don't all necessarily presuppose an underlying rational purpose or design. In those respects, the typology is useful. But in other ways, a typology like this one actually is largely irrelevant, I would say, for the purposes of this congregation. It is crafted by historians, for the interest of historians. In a way, it does nothing but confirm the fact that vitalism is indeed something that we should confine to history. Today, as I said already, some prominent and influential commentators, like the biologist Richard Dawkins, use vitalism as a derogatory label. For him, vitalism is nothing but a relic from a pre-scientific past, an irrational outlook on nature and on the world, one that we should simply dismiss. Now, Dawkins, of course, is a well-known advocate of genetic reductionism, so this judgment on his part shouldn't come as a surprise. Others, however, offer a much more compelling, and I would also say a much more respectful case for regarding vitalism as obsolete. In their well-known work, Order Out of Chaos, which was originally published in 1979, the first English edition was 1984, Nobel Prize winner Ilya Prigogine and philosopher Isabel Stengers, co-authors, present classical vitalism as a form of thought that is deeply correlated with the emergence of modern, classical Newtonian science. Classical vitalism, they argue, developed in the context of a scientific worldview defined by a Newtonian mechanistic understanding of nature, a clockwork universe. The classical science that we have inherited from the 17th century saw nature as a vast automaton, composed of nothing but inert mass, dead matter. There was no place for life in such a conception of nature. The vitalist protest against the physics of the time was a meaningful and relevant response, they say, to the limitations of the conception of Newtonian science. A protest on the part of chemists, of biologists, of physicians, of people who were at the forefront, who had to face directly the complexity of real processes in both chemistry and life. So classical vitalism then makes sense as a response to the limitations of Newtonian or classical science. But we must not make the mistake of identifying science in general with the science of the 18th century, or classical science as I've been calling it. In classical science, write Prigogine and Stengers, I'm quoting from them, the basic processes of nature were considered to be deterministic and reversible. Processes involving randomness or irreversibility were considered only exceptions. Now, in the 20th century, the science of dissipative structures and far from equilibrium thermodynamics has changed all that. Today, we see everywhere the role of irreversible processes and fluctuations. Yes. So, in the context of the science of complexity and emergence, biological organization no longer appears so strange. It doesn't appear as an exception to the laws of nature. Rather, it appears as the supreme expression of the self-organizing processes that occur in far from equilibrium conditions. In other words, what I'm saying here is that contemporary developments in physics and chemistry invite us to imagine nature and matter in a completely different way. Matter is not inert, it's not dead, it's dynamic. It is the expression of an active field of relations rather than a static substance. The whole of nature, not just a subset of it, appears animated, so to speak, appears creative. Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher, captured this transformation in our understanding of nature through the distinction between what he called nature lifeless and nature alive. So what are the implications of this transformation in the scientific outlook? Now, a key implication is, of course, that if all of nature is in a sense alive, there cannot be an absolute hard and fast distinction between living and non-living phenomena. So again, we're at the position where we're not making that distinction. As Victor von Weizsäcker put it, the boundaries between the living and the inanimate are not verifiable either in time or in space, in a dynamic or in a causal sense. Or to say it with Whitehead again, life cannot be a defining characteristic. We should not therefore be looking for a special entity or for special principles that might animate an otherwise static, dead material structure and hence distinguish the living from the non-living. There are only degrees, thresholds of complexity, degrees and thresholds of the capacity for self-organization. Nature is continuous, but there are these degrees and thresholds. Now, what follows from this in terms of vitalism? Well, according to Prigogine and Stengers, what follows from this is that vitalism today is basically redundant. We don't need it anymore. We don't need it anymore because life no longer appears as an exception in the order of nature. So in what sense then is it still possible to speak of contemporary vitalism? And what might it mean to be a vitalist today? Now I'm proposing to answer this question through the work of a thinker that I know very well, a self-proclaimed vitalist who was writing mostly in the second half of the 20th century, who died in 1995, Georges Canguilhem. Canguilhem was a trained biomedical physician, but he spent most of his life working as a historian and philosopher of biology and medicine in France. Now, Canguilhem proposed that vitalism should be understood as an imperative rather than a method, and as an ethical system rather than a theory. Vitalists are people who affirm the originality of life, and this is an attitude, a way of showing up, if you like, rather than being a theory. It's not something abstract, it's a way of being in the world. When the concepts of classical science could not quite account for vital phenomena, such as the type of movement that we see expressed by a bird in flight, classical vitalists, the ones in the 18th century already, they refused to have the specificity of life simply explained away or ignored. They refused to believe that the special characteristics we associate with living beings are only secondary qualities, illusions, that can be explained with reference to something more basic. So, Canguilhem tells us classical vitalism did indeed involve a philosophical error when it posited the existence of a metaphysical force, but it was an error with a very positive function in the history of biology. It provided a form of resistance to the possibility of reductionism, a recurring form of resistance, hence the title of my talk, which I borrow from Canguilhem, The Vitality of Vitalism. Vitalism has been constantly refuted in the history of biology, but it has also constantly come back because the science that it was protesting against was always coming short of what life requires. So vitalism was an era through which the life sciences in particular came to constitute their own specific domain, distinct from the sciences of physics and chemistry. Let's dwell a little bit further on this notion of the originality of life. Vitalists claim, affirm the originality of life. How should we understand this proposition? The philosophical mistake of classical vitalism was to understand originality in the sense of an exception, life as an exception to the laws of the physical world. But as we have seen, classical vitalism was a purely reactive form of thought. Life only appears as an exception if we take the world described by classical physics as the norm, 18th century physics. Instead of regarding life as an exception, says Canguilhem, the science of biology should affirm its own imperialism. A biological mode of thought should become the norm, one that sees nature and matter as vital, should be generalized to the whole of experience, and indeed, the basic sciences of physics and chemistry in the course of the 20th century have come to resemble biology more than the other way around, is true. So if life is not original, in the sense that it constitutes an exception to the laws of nature, in what sense then is it original? For Canguilhem, it's original in the sense that life comes first. Life is the origin. Life is the condition of possibility for knowledge, and therefore it has logical priority, and we should never forget this. Knowledge itself, science itself, should be regarded as a creative manifestation of the activity of the living. It's a creation of life. And the science of the living, in particular, biology, for example, cannot afford to forget this. Cannot afford to forget that knowledge stems from life, and that life is therefore always larger than knowledge. So that's why he calls vitalism an ethical imperative. The ethical imperative that is implicit in vitalism involves a different attitude towards the relationship between scientific knowledge and the world. An attitude where scientific concepts are explicitly regarded as abstractions from a greater whole, rather than true representations. This attitude isn't an attitude of dismissal. It doesn't, the consequence of it is not to say that these abstractions are therefore false and that we can just ignore them. No, abstractions are tools of life. Concepts are tools of life, and as such they're valuable. But they're valuable insofar as they're relevant. Their worth is not guaranteed in advance by a method, but stems rather from what they create, what they add to the possibilities of life. So there isn't a scientific method that will guarantee the value of the knowledge that we produce. The value of that knowledge has to be tested on the ground, as it were. What are the implications of generalizing a biological mode of thought to the whole of experience? Now, following Alfred North Whitehead, we can say that what this implies is regarding nature no longer as indifferent, but rather the whole of nature as permeated with value. In the context of biology, this is fairly obvious. Stenges writes that if we're able to describe something, it is because this something has achieved some endurance. The term achievement is not chosen casually. It points to the fact that, as is especially evident in biology, the identity of anything, is not a neutral given. It is never unproblematically maintained. Rather, it constitutes the successful negotiation and renegotiation of a field of relations in order to endure, the realization of a value. Victor von Weizsäcker was fond of saying that biological facts are always biological acts. They are not simple givens, never simple givens. They are achievements. They have a direction. They are vectors of becoming. They're not static. Canguilhem, too, argued strongly for the importance of acknowledging values as inherent in nature, inherent to the order of life. He believed that in embracing objectivity and quantification uncritically, medicine was in danger of adopting a very limited and reductive conception of health. An example of this is when we diagnose a state of health from the fact that our vital values, like laboratory values, are within the norm. That is, they correspond to objectively defined normal values. Now, in his most famous work, which is entitled The Normal and the Pathological, Canguilhem argued that being healthy involves being normative rather than being normal. It involves being able to live according to your own values, to be relatively undetermined by the environment. So, a degree of relative freedom, if you like. And Canguilhem illustrates this through the example of a children's nanny. I'm quoting from him now. A children's nanny who perfectly discharges the duties of her post and is aware of her hypotension, of her low blood pressure, only through the neurovegetative disturbances she experiences when she's taken on vacation in the mountains. Of course, no one is obliged to live at high altitudes, but one is superior if one can do this, for it can become inevitable at any time. So this is why, for Canguilhem, behind all apparent normality, again I'm quoting from him, one must look to see if that normality is capable of tolerating infractions of the norm, of overcoming contradictions, of dealing with conflicts. Any normality that is limited to maintaining itself as it is, any normality that is hostile to variations and incapable of adapting to new situations, is a normality devoid of normative intention. When confronted with with any apparently normal situation, it is therefore important to ask whether the norms that it embodies are creative norms, norms with a forward thrust, or on the contrary, conservative norms, norms whose thrust is towards the past. So, a physiological norm, an objectively defined value, tells you nothing of the direction, of the thrust of that norm, of how vital that norm is for the individual concerned. For Canguilhem, a vitalist attitude, an attitude that affirms the normativity of life and the originality of life, is an attitude that invites us to consider physiological norms, that is, the objective parameters specified in the science of physiology, as static abstractions from a reality that is much larger and much more dynamic. A vitalist attitude is an attitude that invites us to consider organic possibilities, always in relation to concrete, unique individuals. And for all these reasons, Canguilhem then also stressed the irreducible importance of the practical form of knowledge that is associated with the clinical consultation. In contrast, for example, to the type of knowledge that is developed in laboratories or through epidemiological methods, which is, again, not to dismiss the usefulness of those types of knowledge, but to stress the irreducibility of clinical knowledge. The value of the clinic is original, again, in the sense that it is from this context that medical knowledge is abstracted. Physiology, writes Canguilhem, is the collection of solutions to problems posed by sick men through their illnesses. Again, it's a reactive form of knowledge. We don't know what the next problem that we're going to be faced with might be. We don't know what the next possibility might be. So the clinical consultation is the context where doctors encounter their patients and the life they bring with them, their concerns, their values, indeed their originality, their vital singularity. Moving towards our conclusion now. Contemporary vitalism, in the spirit of someone like Canguilhem, as I've said, refers to an attitude, an ethical imperative that concerns how we view the relationship between life and knowledge. There's a strong affinity between vitalism as an ethical imperative and some of the philosophical implications that arise from the science of complexity. And in these last few remarks, I'm going to turn for one last time to Isabel Stengers to articulate these implications and their affinity with vitalism. So, vitalism and complexity. Stengers says that if the theme of complexity is interesting, it's not because of how it redescribes our world as complex, but rather because of how it transforms the way we think about our relation to our world. The theme of complexity, like the theme of vitalism, implies a certain ethos, a certain redefinition of the classic scientific attitude whose ambition was to represent nature in its totality, in order to control it, in order to master it. So this new ethos can be clarified by looking at the contrast between the notions of complexity and complication. A phenomenon is complicated when the task of predicting its behavior is difficult because we don't have enough information, for example, or because we haven't formulated the question precisely enough. In principle, however, it's possible to explain and understand a complicated phenomenon by extending a simple fundamental model. So, for example, in mechanistic biology, the reality of living being is treated as a tremendously complicated reality, but one that is nevertheless regarded as understandable in principle in terms of the model of a chain of physical, chemical determinations. So it's a matter of filling in the pieces of a puzzle. The puzzle, there may be 1 million pieces, but ultimately there's the notion that the puzzle can be completed at some point. A complex phenomenon, by contrast, is a very different beast. It's a phenomenon whose behavior is difficult to predict, not because we don't have enough information, not because it's enormously complicated, but for reasons that are intrinsic, reasons that cannot be resolved by any foreseeable future. Now, the theme of complexity allows us to address living beings as original and singular, because they're complex beings. So not in the sense that their originality stems from an essential difference with respect to the physical world. Living beings are original and singular in the same way that any complex system is original and singular, on account of their distinctive temporality. Complex systems are not amenable to the deterministic logic that applies to merely complicated systems. We cannot deterministically predict what a complex system will do, and we cannot deterministically predict what a living being will do. So the ethical imperative that is implicit in the theme of complexity is an invitation to learn how to live with forms of uncertainty and forms of doubt, without the anticipation that these will be dispelled one day. An invitation to learn how to practically manage uncertainty without explaining it away, without pretending it isn't there, and how to value this uncertainty as the source of new questions. So now, to conclude, I've articulated today the difference between classical vitalism as an outdated set of scientific hypotheses and contemporary vitalism as an ethical imperative, an attitude of care for the relationship between life and knowledge. Classical vitalism, I argued, leaning on Prigogine and Stengers, made sense as a reaction, as a protest against the limitations of classical science. But it appears redundant and obsolete in the new horizon defined by the sciences of complexity. But as an ethical attitude, vitalism is still extremely current and very necessary indeed. And it's an attitude that involves a number of things. First of all, it involves relating to scientific concepts explicitly as partial abstractions rather than exhaustive representations. It involves, therefore, a certain humility before the possibilities of life, based on the recognition that life is always larger than the concepts that we have of it. It involves a redefinition of priorities and a consideration of what questions become relevant once we accept that uncertainty is irreducible and that nothing in nature is indifferent. Thank you.